Two things before we go on the record. First, I need to go on the oral record for literally probably a minute in another case. And sometime around 10 or 10:15, I think there are going to be some high school students observing public hearings. So they've been told to come in as unobtrusively as possible, but just FYI. They're probably going to keep company in the jury box and or wherever they are. Shannon?
Yes, ma'am.
What's the case number?
The case we have set for trial this morning, Dimitri and Gross, case number 592446.
592446, okay. You ready now? We're here this morning in the case of State of Ohio versus Dimitri and Gross, case number 592446. The plaintiff is represented by the Assistant County Prosecutor Shannon Muss, and she is present and ready for trial scheduled. Remain in the middle of the direct examination of Lance Martini. And, sir, you remain under oath.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Martini.
Good morning.
I believe we left off on page 5 of your report. You indicated that you also reviewed the reports from BCI relative to Zone Car 238.
I did.
And what, if any, findings do you have relative to that? Relative to any bullet strikes that we saw.
Are you speaking of Unit 238 or 217?
238. That's the this paragraph right there.
That of the approximately 139 shots which are thought to have been fired by the surrounding law enforcement personnel, only 30 of those bullet strikes were found present on the Malibu, and 2 striking Unit 238 that can be reliably established using trajectory probes as determined by BCI.
And relative to the 2 strikes on 238, it's contained later in your report, but do you have did you opine relative to where those shots came from?
Yes, I did.
And where was that?
They were fired probably in terms of shooter placement by Officer O'Donnelly.
And did you attach an exhibit to your report reflecting her point of view?
Yes, I did. Page 22, as well as page 23.
All right, showing you page 22 of your report, image 10. Could you identify that?
Those are 2 images. The lower image is from my understanding is from a cell phone photograph taken by Officer O'Donnell showing her relative firing position and perspective.
And are there any defects in the windshield of 238?
Yes, there are.
And is that depicted in this photograph?
Yes, they are.
And again, from your review of photographs, do you have an opinion as to the approximate distance from that shooting location to the passenger in the Malibu that's depicted on the other side of 238?
That, as shown in the perspective in the lower image, that would have been across the width of the unit zone car 238.
So certainly the width of the Cleveland Police Zone car, correct?
That is correct.
That was her approximate shooting location, correct?
That is my understanding.
So if we go back to page 5 of your report. And let's talk about your findings relative to zone car 217. In reviewing your report last night, did you discover that you had omitted a sentence relative to your discussion of Unit 217?
That is correct. The final proof of my report, I discovered had omitted a following on sentence.
Okay, so before we get to that, explain to the court what your findings were relative to the windshield of 217.
Okay, the shots passing through the windshield of CPD Unit 217 are determined to have an inside to outside directionality. Continuing analysis of these shots did not establish if any of them struck the Malibu, and if any did, where they struck.
And relative to that sentence, is there anything that you would like to add that you had omitted?
Yes, I would. There should have been a follow-on sentence along the lines of note, BCI trajectory number 41 is determined to be consistent with originating from the shots of through the windshield by Officer Brelo present in 217.
Objection.
That's a real substantive omission. It's not as if he added one sentence about what he did or something like that.
If I may, the exhibit I'm coming to on page 21 contains a highlighted number 41, and it's consistent. This is the BCI exhibit, Your Honor, and this is the trajectory that the witness is speaking of.
I know, but this is one of his. This is an opinion that so far I think is unique to him, that he has made a determination that BCI's trajectory, or I forget what winner it's called. BCI's bullet hole 41 is consistent with having come through the windshield of 217. I haven't heard anyone else offer that opinion yet.
If I may, Your Honor, that's the shooting location of Officer Brelo.
No, I'm aware.
Side, and it's, again, there's a trajectory rod that goes to the windshield of the Malibu. It's self-evident. It's in the state's evidence, and this witness is simply offering to opine on that. We can see this outside of his report. He indicated it was an omission. Didn't make its way to the draft.
What do you think?
Your Honor, I believe the court restricted the state similarly on when the state was in its case in chief. I believe what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
I think the exact figure of speech is what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Although it's been disfigured over years.
We accept that. It's always subject to argument anyway. It's already in evidence, and you can see there's a trajectory rod, and we could argue that. But I wanted to, the witness brought it to my attention this morning, and so I'm bringing it to the court's attention.
Yeah, I think what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
I readily accept that.
But if it were a misplaced comma or a sentence that said, oh, I also reviewed such and such, that's something different. But this is substantive, so the objection is sustained.
We go back to page 5 of this with your report, Mr. Martini, would it be a fair statement that the next two paragraphs speaks of Officer Moore and Officer Brelo's shots relative to 217 that were fired?
Yes, and along with the Malibu vehicle being equipped with seatbelt restraints, which were not in use.
Okay. And then at the bottom of the paragraph, you reviewed the reports from BCI relative to the footwear impressions of Officer Brelo, correct?
I did, yes.
And again, your findings relative to his footwear impressions were Officer Brelo's?
Well, consistent with BCI's determination that the footprints which were identifiable were identified as being present on the Malibu in the general area of the front passenger side hood of the Malibu.
Okay, and what about relative to Zone Car 238?
That there were footprint impressions also present on the trunk area.
Okay. And also the roof as well, correct?
Yes, if I remember correctly.
Now, did there come a time when you had the occasion to review photographs from the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office relative to mannequins that were created in this case?
Yes, I did.
Have you had the occasion to opine on and utilize mannequins in the past?
Yes, I have.
And are there any limitations with respect to the usage of mannequins in determining trajectories and gunshot reconstruction?
Yes, there are.
What are those?
There are a number of variables depending on the mannequins chosen, the type and style. There are factors of concern in terms of being proportioned to the trajectory, to the individuals being trajectory, wound paths being demonstrated. The height, overall height of the mannequins should match that of the decedent. The weight in certain instances is important as to the mannequin. When you have a situation where you have an individual positioned on a compressible surface, such as a vehicle seat, that could be a concern, also a variable. Also, too, in terms of anatomical movement, the positions, the placement of how the particular mannequin bends or can be bent may be a concern.
In spite of those limitations, were you able to opine in this case by virtue of looking at the photographs of the mannequins as well as reviewing the autopsy reports for the decedents?
Yes, I was.
And if we can show you image number 9 on page 20 of your report, what were your findings relative to your gunshot reconstruction from reviewing the mannequins and the autopsy reports?
There were a series of what was described in the photographs of the mannequins, described as lethal gunshot wounds, and mannequins demonstrated the wound paths associated with those wounds. As can be seen in the exhibit, there are a number of what I would describe as significantly downward direction wound paths. It can be noted visually that there are a number of those which exhibit a parallel type path. If the wound paths are considered in terms of their parallel natures, in terms of their directionality, and in terms of their placement placement on the upper body, the torso area of the mannequin. Certain conclusions can be reached in terms of the direction of fire and the placement of the shooter at the time those shots were fired.
And in making those determinations, again, you reviewed the photographs of the mannequins and also the autopsy reports of the decedents, correct?
Yes, I did.
And in addition, did you also confer with any other medical examiner?
Yes, I did.
And who was that?
Dr. Posey was an individual which I conferred with on several occasions.
And did you review any other reports from another medical examiner?
Yes, I did.
And who was that?
That was Dr. Rowe.
And as a result of reviewing the reports from Dr. Rowe and also your communications with Dr. Posey and a review of his report, what, if anything, did you conclude from that?
That at the time that a number of those wounds were created on both the passenger as well as the driver of the Malibu vehicle, that the shooter as well as the individual being discussed were relatively stable, not moving at the time those shots occurred. And by grouping those shots, a certain determination can be made as to the relative positioning of the shooter.
And when you indicated stable or not moving, you're not competent to render a medical opinion as to whether someone was dead or alive at that point, correct?
I am not, no.
Okay. But if they were, given the nature of the gunshot wounds and given your experience in this area, would it be a fair statement that because of the parallel wound tracks, that both decedents were either incapacitated or dead? Objection correct?
That would be correct.
Again, these were mannequins that depicted lethal wounds sustained by both decedents as determined by the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office.
That is my understanding, yes.
With respect to Ms. Williams, did you discover that there were other lethal shots not depicted on her mannequin because it was determined that one or two of them were post-mortem?
That is my understanding, yes.
So those two trajectory rods are not included on her mannequin, correct?
That is correct.
As you view this document, that would be those trajectory rods, one would have come from her right side, correct?
If I remember correctly, yes.
And one into her left eye?
That would be correct also.
So from reviewing the records that you've testified to here today, what is your opinion relative to the location of the shooter relative to her gunshot wounds depicted here?
I'm sorry, I got lost in the question.
With respect to her mannequin, I'll just ask you in general terms, what are your findings relative to an examination of the trajectory rods and the other materials that you just testified to?
I need to look at my image a little bit larger.
I believe it's reflected on page 6 of your report.
The female passenger sustained 6 lethal gunshot wounds, all to the torso area, which are identified as gunshot wounds 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 in terms of the female passenger.
Okay. And of these, continue, I don't want to interrupt your testimony. Further explain why you have circles around 8 and 13 and what your findings were relative to 9, 10, 11, and 12.
8 and 13 were determined to be inconsistent with gunshots fired by Officer Brelo. The remaining 4 wound paths, as represented on the mannequin, were consistent with shots fired by Officer Brelo,
And why is that?
And due to their placement on the body, the upper torso area, as well as their significant downward angle or trajectory. Also, too, it can be noted that the trajectories can be associated into two groups of wound paths. That would be trajectory number 10 and number 12, as well as trajectory number 9, and I believe it's 11. I can't see it clearly from here.
10 and 12 and 9 and 11?
That would be correct.
And would you please explain to the court, relative to gunshot wounds 10 and 11, and I'm sorry, 10 and 12 and 9 and 11, whether or not you opine that there are any parallel wound tracks there?
Trajectories associated with gunshot wounds, and again, using the numbers on the mannequin, number 10 and number 12 exhibit relatively similar wound paths in terms of the downward angles and as far as the angles from a left to right, right to left delineation.
And with respect to 9 and 11, what do those wound paths tell you?
Similar to 10 and 12, both trajectories 9 and 11 exhibit similar directionality in terms of the left to right, right to left delineation, as well as their downward angularity.
And again, from your background and experience, what does the fact that these grouping of gunshot wounds 10 and 12 and 9 and 11 tell you relative to there being parallel wound tracks?
At the time those groupings were discharged, fired, that the shots which exhibit the parallel wound paths are typically indicative of that portion of the body, as well as the shooter being relatively stable and not undergoing any type of significant movement.
And again, your testimony with respect to those four gunshot wounds, specifically 10 and 12 and 9 and 11, do you have an opinion based on reasonable medical certainty as to the location of the shooter for those wounds?
Objection.
Wow, you did say reasonable medical certainty, and he's already
I'm
said
sorry,
it's not.
reasonable scientific certainty. I misspoke.
Right, overruled.
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
That shots 10 and 12, 9 and 11 were fired by Officer Brelo while firing from an elevated position.
And have you reviewed the record to determine what were the elevated positions that Officer Brelo was firing from?
The elevated positions, as reported in the reports, were from the back of Unit 238 while positioned on the trunk, as well as the position of Officer Brelo while standing on the hood of the Malibu.
And do you have an opinion whether or not he fired any of these shots from one of those two locations or the other?
Specifically, no, I don't.
I don't know the nature of the objection.
I don't believe that is stated in his report.
It is.
I suppose I have to choose one, because I've read it, but I haven't scrutinized it. I'll say overruled. 50-50.
You may answer.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Do you think they were fired from the hood of the Malibu, the trunk of the zone car, or can you not tell?
All I can state is that they are consistent with being fired from an elevated position.
The same elevated position?
Well, we have two different groupings there, so that would indicate that a change of either the officer and or the decedent.
Long story short, you can't really tell.
That is correct.
Pardon my interruption.
Would it be consistent from being fired from 238?
It could be, yes.
And would also be consistent with having been fired from the hood of the Malibu?
That is correct.
And I believe in your report, you also indicated that based on, there was some change in directionality, correct?
That is correct, between the pairs.
And that would be explained in, I believe you referred to two different ways. What would the explanation be for the change in directionality?
Either movement on the part of the decedent or movement on the part of the officer.
Would the movement on the part of the officer be the point of aim of the weapon?
It could be, yes.
Or a change of position?
That also would be correct.
Relative to gunshot wound 8 and 13, what were your findings relative to those two gunshot wounds?
Those two gunshot wounds entered the torso of the decedent at a distinctly different directionality than the just previously discussed wound paths. Those two, specifically wound path number 8 and wound path number, I believe it's 13, entered from what I would consider to be consistent from a ground level discharge.
So would it be a fair statement that gunshot wounds 8 and 13 are inconsistent with shots fired from the elevated shooter position from the trunk of 238 or the hood of the Mal?
That would be correct.
You indicate in your report that you did confer with Dr. Posey and reviewed the report from Dr. Rowe, correct?
I did, yes.
And relative to the lethal shots depicted on the Williams mannequin on page 6 of your report, do you indicate what the total number of lethal shots would be? The last paragraph at the bottom of page 6.
At the point of time that this was written, my conclusion was of the 7 or 8, which includes the 1 or 2 headshots, plus the 6 described torso shots, which are all lethal wound paths, which were sustained by the passenger, that 4 of those paths exhibit a significant downward direction and can be associated into pairs of similar directionality within the horizontal and vertical planes.
Now, again, the total number of lethal shots as depicted on the mannequin for Miss Williams is what?
We have a total of 6 there.
Okay. And from your review of Dr. Posey's report and Dr. Rowe's report, how many other fatal lethal shots do we now have based on their opinions?
Objection.
Overruled.
2 additional to the head.
And I think your report indicates that based on a review of all those, you're not taking a position because you don't have the competence to opine on that, correct?
That is correct.
You're just indicating from a review of the expert reporting in this case, Miss Williams either sustained 7 or 8 lethal gunshot wounds, correct?
That is correct.
Relative to the 2 fatal shots to her head, which are not depicted in this diagram of the mannequin,
That would be correct.
do you opine based on your review of the reports of Dr. Rowe and Dr. Posey the directionality of those gunshot wounds?
Objection.
Because what, not in the report? Or their opinions are not yet in evidence?
Both.
It's in the
Well,
report,
we're
Your Honor.
pretty sure they're going to testify.
They are. Dr. Posey's not available until Thursday, otherwise.
Yeah, and we've done the same thing with the state, is we know some opinions are coming in. Overruled.
You may answer.
The question, please.
Okay, if you look to page 7 of your report at the top, do you opine as to the direction that the fatal shots to the head of Miss Williams, where they came from?
I'm attempting to find that within my report.
I think you said page 8. Did I hear you right?
I misspoke again, Your Honor. Page 7,
gunshot wounds 8 and 13, and those to the head are determined to exhibit significantly different directionality and or locations compared to gunshot wounds 9, 10, 11, and 12.
With the next paragraph of your report, you indicate, I think you already testified as to the location of the shooter for those 4, 9, 10, 11, and 12, correct?
That is correct.
If you then go to the next paragraph, do you opine on the location of the shooter relative to gunshot wounds 8, 13, and those to the head of Ms. Williams?
Correct. Gunshot wounds 8 and 13 and those to the head are determined to be inconsistent with shots fired from an elevated shooter position on the body of CPD Unit 238 or the hood of the Malibu.
And your next paragraph, you further opine?
Gunshot wounds 9, 10, 11, and 12 are determined to be consistent with shots fired after the passenger was rendered incapacitated by the lethal shots, gunshot wounds 8, 13, and those to the head.
And that conclusion that you make is based upon what?
My reconstruction and also in conference and communication with Dr. Posey.
Does your finding of parallel wound tracks also support your opinion that you've just expressed?
Yes, it does.
If you continue on to your next paragraph, you again get into the location and further description, location of the shooter for gunshot wounds 8, 13, and those to the head, and also the wound characteristics of those wounds.
No specific area of origin in terms of shooter location is conclusively determined for gunshot wounds 8, 13, and those to the head, other than originating from a ground level, non-elevated shots. Considering the irregular entrance wound characteristics, it is probable that these bullets impacted glass and or metal prior to striking the passenger. These bullets would have entered the Malibu through the windshield or front passenger side window area.
And when you speak of the front passenger side window, does image 10 on page 22 of your report reflect that shooter position?
In part, yes.
And the other part would be what?
The trajectory diagram, which is present on my page 21. Where you have shots being fired from the passenger side of the vehicle in the areas generally attributed to Officer O'Donnell and also possibly Officer Ereg.
If you strike that, you indicated you've reviewed a number of documents and BCI reports in this case, correct?
Yes, I did.
And have you also reviewed a shooting animation that was presented to BCI in this case?
Objection.
Yes, I did.
When you speak of the, I want to show you image 13 on page 25 of your report. Have you seen this before?
Yes, I have.
And what's that?
That is, what page was that again, please?
25.
The image represented there is described as a corrected visual evidence shooting animation image, which depicts the approximated shooting locations of the firing officers.
Okay. And you also attached to your report, do you not, on page... document that depicts cartridge casings that were recovered and identified by BCI.
Yes, I do.
Image 3, page 15.
That is correct.
And these were color-coded and assigned an officer name relative to where the cartridge casings were found, correct?
By BCI, that is correct.
And that color code, although it's not blurry on this document, but it's found on page 14 of your report, image 2, correct?
That is correct. That was the source image.
Okay. And if we go to image 3 on page 15, there's a grouping of shell casings that I'm pointing to here. Would those be the shell casings attributed to Officer O'Donnell?
That would be correct.
And there's 2 that were recovered out of the 6 fired by Officer Ehrig, where I'm also pointing, correct?
That would be correct.
And that's on that, where were those casings found, generally speaking?
I don't understand the question.
Well, where were these casings found relative to the scene of where the shooting occurred?
Those would have been identified as being located on the grassy area of the slope.
On the passenger side of 238?
On the passenger side, yes.
Okay. So if we go to your image number 13 on page 25 of your report.
Objection.
Based on?
Based on the fact that they filed a motion in limine prior to trial to have us not use the visual animation evidence, we agreed not to admit it, and now they are using it in their...
Well, it's not going to be admitted as substantive evidence. As I look at this diagram, the so-called shooters are very roughly where Soraya placed them in his testimony the other day. It's a visual aid. Now I understand the objection, and I can't fault you for it, but overruled.
And Your Honor, I'm just offering this in terms of the demonstrative exhibit. But we filed a motion. I think they withdrew the animation. There was no agreement. Just
Well, I think like I said, I think I get the reason for the objection, and I overruled.
So does this image that you have here generally depict officer names and the numbers of shots fired from the particular locations they were positioned in an approximate manner?
The approximate positions and calculated number of shots fired. That is correct.
Okay, so relative to your testimony as to the ground level location of the shots fired for the gunshot wounds, number one to the right side of Ms. Williams' head, you have here depicted Officer Ehrig's position and Officer O'Donnell's, correct?
That is correct.
How many shots did Officer O'Donnell fire?
Let me find that here. A total of 12 shots.
And what about Officer Ehrig? How many shots did he fire?
I was calculated to have fired 6 shots.
And relative to others shooter positions, since we have this exhibit up now, you have Officer Demchek set forth. He fired 4 shots, correct?
Correct.
And Officers Farley and Sobolik, they also each fired 4 shots, correct?
That is correct.
If we go back to the page 15, the BCI scene diagram. The area where I'm pointing to casings or markers 4, 8, 9, and 10. It's 5, 6, 7. shots, those are shell casings found that are related to the weapons of Officer Farley and Sabota, correct?
That is correct.
And Officer Demchek's are found at 21, 23, 14, and 24, correct?
If I remember correctly, yes.
And we then have other shell casings there, 16, 17, 18, 19, and some others that are attributed to Officer Sistek, correct?
Correct.
And from your review of page 25 of your report, Officer Sistek fired how many shots?
Officer Sistek fired 12 shots.
And if we go to the passenger side of 217, I think that's a turquoise color, 10, 128, 101, 129, etc., and then a purplish color, 28, 29, 39, 34, 105, 126, and others. Those are shots in the area where Officer Moore and Patrick were positioned, correct?
That is correct.
And how many shots did Officer Patrick fire?
9 shots.
And Officer Moore fired how many shots?
19 shots.
And some of those, approximately 7, is that the number you recall, were fired from inside the passenger compartment of 217?
That would be correct.
And from your review of the record in this case, would it be a fair statement that these shooters were all shooting at the occupants of the Malibu, correct?
That would be correct.
With respect to, on page 7 of your report, was there a difference in opinion from Dr. Rowe from the other medical examiners in this case regarding gunshot wound number 11?
Yes, there is.
And what was that opinion that Dr. Rowe expressed relative to gunshot wound number 11?
There is what I would describe as a difference in directionality, specifically the angle of gunshot wound that they disagreed on.
And was it based on Dr. Rowe's opinion of the path of that bullet, your determination that her opinion proved accurate, that would have come from what type of a shooting position? Elevated or ground level?
That would have been, I'm looking for that here.
It's the third paragraph from the bottom on page 7.
That gunshot wound number 11 would be consistent with a shot fired from a ground level location.
And did you depict Dr. Rowe's opinion on the very last page of your report with a green trajectory rod?
Yes, I did.
So you actually made that green rod, correct? Or you configured it through some type of computer assist?
I entered it into the image, yes.
Okay. And your image 15 on page 27 depicts what?
The gunshot wound as represented by Dr. Rowe, that would be for gunshot wound number 11.
Go back to page 8. Mr. Martini, based on your years of experience, have you ever encountered a situation where you were at the scene of a shooting where the victims were deceased and there was any movement of the bodies?
Yes, that is correct.
Well, I don't exactly know why you're objecting, but I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean, well, I don't know what you mean, but he must. But what's the objection?
There's nothing remotely about that in the report. Movement of bodies.
Well, but this is from experience, and so but is the question where somebody has moved the bodies, or
No,
the bodies have wriggled themselves?
There was movement by the body itself.
Your Honor, he has
After
no
death?
experience.
Pardon me?
After death?
Yes.
So you're asking, have you been to a shooting where you've seen a body move after it's dead? Is that what you're
Yes.
asking? I guess if he has a personal observation, he can.
Where subsequent to the death of the individual, additional movement has occurred to the decedent. Yes, I have.
And explain that.
Some of those involve vehicle-to-vehicle and or drive-by shootings where individuals in a vehicle were shot, such as a passenger, subsequent to the headshot to the passenger, a subsequent accident occurred, and the positioning of the passenger within the vehicle changed significantly.
Other than a subsequent accident, have you ever encountered a movement of a dead body while you were on the scene that was positioned on a bed?
Yes, I have, yes.
And describe that to the court.
This was a situation where this was a murder-suicide situation where the decedent had been deceased actually for several days on a waterbed. Upon investigation by the laboratory and homicide team, while present within the room, the body actually rolled over slightly within the bed without any contact by the investigation team.
What could be an explanation for movement of a dead body from your experience?
Objection.
Sustained.
Well, there's been testimony submitted in this case that Brelo officers observed some movement of the body, and I'm trying to provide a foundation.
Well, and I heard that testimony from Barchak, but I haven't heard background sufficient to satisfy myself that you're an expert in post-mortem movement of bodies. So it could be gravity, which all of us would understand, and we don't need his expertise to hear about it.
That's
but otherwise, if it's something physiological or neurological or something like that, we probably need a different person.
I wasn't going for that, but I was trying to go for the gravity and explain his experience.
Well,
Well,
but
that's
that's-
objection to the doctor if he asks the same question.
That would be, I think would be a reasonable argument, but it's beyond this witness's area of expertise, so the objection is sustained.
If we can, Mr. Martini, I'd like to turn to your review of the mannequin and the gunshot wounds for the driver, Mr. Russell. And starting on page 7 of your report at the bottom, how many lethal wounds were found on Mr. Russell?
There were 9 lethal torso wound paths sustained by the driver, and all of those exhibit a significant downward direction.
And were there also lethal shots to his head?
That is correct, yes.
And there were 2 more, so that brought a total of 11 lethal wounds to Mr. Russell, correct?
That is correct.
What were your findings relative to the torso shots? And I will move forward to the mannequin that we displayed before, which is image 8 on page 20 of your report. On the right-hand side, is this the mannequin depicting Mr. Russell's lethal wounds?
Yes, it is.
And there's 2 to the head, correct?
Correct.
And 9 to the torso, correct?
That is correct.
So what were your findings relative to these wounds?
That 5 of the gunshot wounds, specifically 15A, 15F, and I'll just use the letters from here on, G, H, and I exhibit similar / parallel wound paths. Gunshot wounds C and E are also observed to exhibit similar parallel wound paths.
If I may, this is 15C and 15E that I'm pointing to that you just identified.
Correct?
And you have a black circle around 15B and D, correct?
That is correct.
Do those two gunshot wounds, 15B and D, exhibit a different directionality?
They are parallel but exhibit similar parallel wound paths.
Parallel wound paths, but what about directionality?
They are significantly different from the other torso gunshot wounds.
Okay. If we can continue on your report on page 8. You've identified 15C and E as having a parallel wound track. Excluding 15B and D, what were your findings relative to the remaining gunshots depicted here? 15G, H, I, F, and A.
That those wound paths are determined to be consistent with shots fired from an elevated shooter position on the body of CPD Unit 238 or from the hood of the Malibu.
And again, because of the parallel gunshot wounds, would the same determinations you made relative to Ms. Williams also apply to Mr. Russell?
Yes, they would.
And specifically, that would be what?
That at the time those wounds occurred, that the shooter and the decedent were not moving, or at least to any significant extent.
As it relates to gunshot wounds 15B and D, what were your findings relative to those two gunshot wounds?
That gunshot wounds B and D are generally similar in their downward and left to right directionality and are distinctly different from the other torso wound paths present in the driver. These wound paths are determined to be consistent with entering through the driver's window opening of a Malibu.
Continue.
It is probable that these shots would have been fired by Officer Diaz.
Objection.
Again, I haven't scrutinized it. It's been a while since I've read it. Is that the basis or something else?
No, actually, Your Honor, it's, I believe the next paragraph that Mr. D'Angelo is going to get into includes this expert's reliance on Officer Diaz's statement, which is not an evidence.
That is true, but we do have that's true, but we do have in evidence an approximation of where Diaz was when he shot.
I have no objection if he's willing to narrow it based on that, but to the extent that his opinion is based on Officer Diaz's statements, I've got to say.
Your Honor,
Right.
respond.
Well, Diaz, we don't have to have a long debate for every objection. This particular objection is overruled, but he can't base his, well, let me put it this way. Here at trial, the opinions are based on the trial evidence, not evidence that is not going to be presented at trial. As I understand, Diaz is not expected to testify, nor is there a witness with personal knowledge expected to testify about exactly where Diaz was when he shot. We do know where he approximately was based on the location of some shell casings. So, but this particular objection is overruled. I assume that we're going to have to get back to the question.
Mr. Martini, based upon the location of the cartridge cases for Officer Diaz, let me withdraw that. Page 25, image 3, you have noted here the number of gunshots fired by Officer Diaz, correct?
That is correct.
And it indicates here 4 shots fired, and there's an arrow pointing to the back of the driveway, correct?
Which is located in the upper area of the image.
Okay. your attention to image 2, which is page 14 of your report, another BCI document, which I think is also a state's exhibit. Is there an island that's depicted in the back section of this driveway, closest to the school?
Yes, there is.
And did you review this document?
Yes, I did.
And why did you attach this to your report?
This is a source document of which a lot of my analysis was based on.
Are there, I think it's either purple or pink shell casings attributed to Officer Diaz?
That is correct, yes.
And where are those located?
In the general area of the vehicle marks which go across the island.
Were there any other, were there tire tracks located on this island?
Yes, there are.
Were there any skid marks on the curb of the island?
Yes, there were.
And based on your review of the physical scene documents, the tire tracks, shell casings, do you have an opinion as to the shooter location for gunshot wounds 15B and D?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
That Officer Diaz would have been in close proximity to the Malibu at the time he discharged his firearm.
And not only in close proximity, but is he the person that you opine shot Mr. Russell, and those gunshot wounds are depicted in gunshot wounds 15B and D?
That is correct.
Overruled.
Is that opinion based on reasonable scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
Going to image 10 on page 22 of your report, you have a note to note the heights of officers relative to driver's side of Malibu. What's the significance of that notation that you included in this image?
The image depicts the relative height of the officer standing adjacent to the driver's side window of the Malibu in terms of relative heights, the spatial orientation. You can see that an officer firing from that position would have a significant downward angularity if aiming at the driver.
And, for example, in this photograph, there's an officer, what appears to be a flashlight, looking at the interior portion of the driver's side of the vehicle, correct?
That is correct.
And from reviewing the scene, would it be apparent that the officers depicted were up on the curb on the grass area to the left of the driver's side of Malibu?
Actually, I would position them in the roadway relative to the Malibu.
And what about the officer behind him?
Back further, I didn't really address those relative positions, only the officer adjacent to the driver's side door.
Okay. But even standing on the roadway, you're saying there's a steep angularity to the gunshot?
That is correct.
If you can refer back to page 8 of your report. The middle paragraph that I'm pointing to, without reading any statements attributed to Officer Diaz, could you please set forth any of your other specific findings as to your opinion and what are your bases for making those opinions?
We have physical evidence which identifies the location of the Malibu and Officer Diaz at the time his shots were fired. We have physical evidence that demonstrates that the Malibu did come over the island and was making a turn when it came off of the island, that the downward angularity of the shots striking the driver would be accentuated if the Malibu was angled in a side-to-side orientation, with the driver's side lower than the passenger side on the island and or while coming off of the island.
And you can continue.
Okay, and this determination was discussed with and confirmed with Dr. Posey.
What if any significance would the tire tracks on the island and the skid mark on the curb have relative to your opinion?
That is physical evidence which demonstrates the path of the Malibu that it took across that area of the parking lot. The change in height, the change in angularity of the Malibu as it traversed the island, came off the island into the parking lot, those angularity changes would accentuate, because of body roll and spatial relationships, the shots fired by Officer Diaz.
And relative to gun shot wounds 15B and D, what were your other findings?
That those two shots, 15B and D, are also considered to be inconsistent with being produced by any other officer based on the locations of the firing officers as established by the physical evidence.
We can go to image 5. Want me to do it out there? Sorry, Judge, I'm doing my best with this. With respect to image 5, bullet hole 75, you opine as to the shooter for that bullet hole?
Yes, I did.
And I'm pointing to the document, image 5, the left-hand portion of the photograph. What's depicted therein?
That is the trajectory determined by BCI and identified as a trajectory number 75.
And what were your conclusions relative to bullet hole 75?
That trajectory 75 was a result of a shot fired by Officer Diaz.
Go to page 8 at the bottom of your report. What did you determine relative to the shooter location for gunshots 1 and 2 to the head of Mr. Russell?
No specific area of origin, the shooter location, is determined for gunshot wounds 1 and 2, the headshots to the driver.
Continue.
Considering the irregular entrance wound characteristics and the mobility of the head, it is probable that these bullets impacted glass and or metal prior to striking the driver.
Continue.
These bullets would have entered the Malibu through one of the passenger side window areas or the rear window and would have been fired from a ground level location. This determination was discussed with and confirmed by Dr. Posey.
So, your opinion based on reasonable scientific certainty is that?
Objection.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree.
Mr. Martini, image 3, page 15 of your report, the shell casings. Again, the shell casings on the grassy knoll area that you just testified to relative to the passenger side of the 238 was from O'Donnell and Erie, correct?
That is,
Objection.
Are you objecting based on the form of the question or
Yes, Your
otherwise?
Honor.
Yeah. I did sort of have a similar observation of Mr. Gutierrez's direct. You gotta direct with open-ended questions.
But some of these, Your Honor, I'm not trying to argue the point, but they're somewhat foundational and...
Anyway, but there's a way to do it.
Directing your attention to the rear portion of car 238, are there black colored numbers depicting another officer's shell casings?
There are.
And whose might those be?
We have in that area shots fired by Officer Ereg as well as Officer Rinkus and Salupo.
How many shots were fired by Officer Salupo?
Officer fired 2 shots.
And Officer Rinkus?
Officer Rinkus fired 13 shots.
And Officer Ereg?
Fired 6 shots.
And Officer O'Donnell fired 12 shots, correct?
That is also correct.
From the grassy knoll area to the passenger side of 238, correct?
Is it form again?
Yes, sir.
I'm inclined to agree. Let's do it right, I guess I would say.
We can go to page 9 of the report. Doctor, with respect to the very top paragraph, again, what was your opinion relative to the shooter location for gunshot wounds 1 and 2 on Mr. Russell?
But he said he couldn't determine one. Are those the head wounds? I'm sorry.
Yes, the head wounds, Your Honor.
Those were the head wounds.
My notes are that he couldn't specify a shooter location for the head wounds.
But that continues, Your Honor, onto the next page, top of page 9. Can you please state your opinion?
Beginning on page 8 or...
Page 9.
Okay.
And you're speaking with reference to what gunshot wounds?
Okay. These are gunshot wounds 1 and 2, present in the head of the driver, Mr. Russell. That these bullets would have entered the Malibu through one of the passenger side window areas or the rear window and would have been fired from a ground level location.
And you refer to the images that we just reviewed, correct?
Correct.
And which shooters would be consistent with that ground level position?
Objection.
Yeah, we could say that for closing argument. I mean,
If you go to page 10 of your report, Mr. Martini. You determined that there were a certain number of ground shots in this case?
I did, yes.
And how many ground level shots did you determine were fired?
Approximately 120 ground level shots.
And what is that based on?
Starting with an approximate number of 139 total shots. If you remove the 15 shots attributed to Officer Brelo while firing from an elevated location, the 4 shots fired by Officer Diaz, which are established, then we have 120 ground level shots fired by other officers.
And continue.
Officers Demchek, Farley, Sabalik, Sistek, and Brelo discharged a total of 58 ground level shots from an overlapping area encompassing the driver's side of CPD Unit 217, which is to the rear trunk area of CPD Unit 238. Officers Patrick, Box, and Moore discharged a total of 29 ground level shots from the general area on the passenger side and or forward of CPD Unit 217.
And what did you further conclude relative to the Malibu?
With the distribution of shooting officers around the Malibu and the large number of shots fired, a significant crossfire situation existed. Officers reported hearing the sound of gunfire originating from the general location of the Malibu, seeing glass exploding from the vehicle, that's in quotes, and bullets fragments flying by, also in quotes, or even hitting them under nighttime and constantly changing lighting conditions.
And your last sentence there in that paragraph is what?
These statements are consistent with the physical evidence.
And what did you find relative to the directionality of shots fired from the grassy slope area that's depicted in the next paragraph?
Okay. Partially visible in image 4 on the left side of the photograph, that would be southeast of CPD Unit 238, is a grass-covered slope which increases in elevation the further away from CPD Unit 238 and the Malibu that one moves. Shots fired by officers while located on this slope could produce a trajectory similar in directionality to a shot fired from an elevated location above ground level.
Image 9 on page 21 of your report. You referenced that in your last paragraph when you speak of bullet holes 86, 87, 88, and 89, correct?
Correct.
What was your determination relative to those bullet holes? And they're on the area to the right of the photograph, correct? 86, 87, 88, and 89?
That is correct.
And what were your findings?
The determined trajectories 86, 87, 88, and 89 can be excluded from being fired by Officer Brelo and are consistent with being fired by Officers Ereg and O'Donnell.
Continue.
A total of 18 shots were fired by Officers Ereg and O'Donnell. The 3 shots which struck the windshield of CPD 238 are consistent with being fired by Officer O'Donnell.
Image 10 on page 22 of your report depicts the point of view of Officer O'Donnell, correct?
That is correct.
And do you see bullet holes in the rear passenger window of the Malibu?
I do, yes.
You also see bullet holes in the metal post right next to the passenger, separating the back seat from the front seat.
The B column, yes.
Now, are there bullet holes there?
There are, yes.
Image 14 on page 26 of your report, what does that depict?
That depicts a laboratory documentation photograph of the Malibu while it was examined.
And what was the significance of this photograph that you attached to your report?
It shows some of the bullet strikes present on the passenger side of the Malibu, as well as some of the reconstruction in terms of bullet impacts to the rear window. Visible present in the upper right-hand corner of the rear passenger door window, it's taped over. There's a little bit of a reflection there, but there's also a hole, a defect in the window consistent with the passage of a bullet.
Is that 86, the top right of the rear passenger window?
Yes, it is.
And does bullet 86 have a trajectory rod?
Yes, it does.
And the green rods, what do those three trajectory rods depict relative to shooter locations?
Those would have been discharged by a shooter present on the passenger side and more to the rear relative to the Malibu.
Mr. Martini, if we go back to page 20 of your report, image 8, the mannequin depicting the lethal wounds to Mr. Russell. You have 4 black circles there. What do those depict?
The 4 circled trajectory rods depict shots which are excluded, eliminated from being fired by Officer Brelo.
And you've testified about 15 B and D already, correct?
That is correct.
And you've also testified about gunshot wounds 1 and 2, correct?
That is correct.
If you could turn to page 11 of your report. The third paragraph. Did you opine relative to the audio recordings in this case?
Yes, I did.
And what were your findings relative to that?
Objection.
Relative to the shooting reconstruction, Your Honor, he's not giving opinion on the recording itself.
Overrule, well, is your question really, how did these influence your opinions? Or what his opinion is of the recording itself?
No, he, can I have another try at the question?
Sure, and we'll see if there's an objection.
Do you opine in your report on the last sequence of shots in this case?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
Objection.
Well, before you give it, which you may or may not, we'll find out in a minute, what's it based on?
The last sequence of shots, and this is based on my review of the audio recording results as analyzed by the various experts, as well as the physical evidence associated with the Malibu vehicle, as well as the downward trajectories to the occupants.
So, in other words, Ms. Barnhill, it sounds like he looked at the same evidence we have, or much of it. Your next question is?
What was your opinion with respect to the last sequence of shots and in terms of your shooting reconstruction?
I'll say overruled.
Based on the timing of these 3 shots within the series of Officer Brelo's position on the hood of the Malibu, Officer Brelo may have perceived some or all of these shots as being fired by the vehicle occupants.
Objection.
Overruled.
Officer Brelo could have observed, as other officers did, glass fragments coming off and away from the front of the Malibu's windshield. This glass spray could have been easily interpreted as resulting from outward traveling shots fired from within the Malibu.
You didn't start, what was the first sentence in that paragraph?
If the 3 inconclusive shots on the dash cam recording are shots by another or other shooters, then Officer Brelo would have been on the hood of the Malibu when these 3 shots were discharged.
Let me interrupt you. How many more minutes do you have on direct?
I think I'm almost done, Your Honor.
All right, Rob, you okay? So here's what we'll do. We'll finish the direct, we'll take a break, and we'll go into the cross.
That's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. D'Angelo. Sir, you remain under oath and obligated to return to the stand after this break. It'll be about 15 minutes or so.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We're off the record.